So welcome everybody to this dialogue with a conscious thought leader. I quickly introduce Michael in a second on why I think he's a conscious thought leader. I just mentioned the protocol. Feel free to introduce yourself, those that are actually coming late in the chat. Say hello and give us a quick idea where you call in from. This is helpful. You're invited to leave the camera on. You don't have to. It depends on the specific circumstances. What is actually appreciated is close the microphone, and we call it a dialogue, and I'm repeating this. It is a dialogue. I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions with Michael. I just call him Michael and not Professor Pearson, but that's actually what he is, a professor at Fordham University. Pretty academic guy, but good fun as well. A rare breed to come along that actually covers both. So we will open the dialogue, and you can actually leave any question, comment in the chat. Okay, this is a Zoom call. It's not a webinar, so we don't have a Q&A section. And this is by intention because we prefer to be interactive, to see each other, to talk to each other. Leave your comment or question, it doesn't have to be a question, in the chat. I may reserve that right to me as a moderator, either maybe refer to your question, put two or three together, if they fit in the flow of the conversation, articulate them directly, or I may invite you directly to speak up on your own behalf. Both is possible, so be ready if you ask a question that actually we may ask you. I'll be very quick. You have a quite academic background. I'm going to start with studying in St. Gallen, and I could actually add my first question to that. I won't. St. Gallen is not really known for being very anti-capitalistic, even though I don't pretend that you're anti-capitalistic, but for alternative way of thinking. They're in the Central European hemisphere known to be a very elite, high level, high quality type of educational institution. So you received your education there. You then went on actually as an associate professor, and you did some research associate in Harvard. You started as an assistant professor in 2008, associate professor in 2013, became a full professor in Fordham University, that was in New York, in 2020. And you have one of the chairs in the Gabelli School of Business since 2021. So what do you, and this is a provocative question, having had such an ample academic background, made you so interested in business and feel qualified to speak to business people and how they should manage their business humanistically?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Konstantin, and welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. So I think you pulled my academic CV, so that's why you get academic stations. But yeah, I worked in business for quite some time. I was a consultant. I did start my own businesses, social enterprises and others. And so I did have experience in that field, understanding that at one point I thought business is an engine for transformation. I can tell you that before that, I thought maybe the traditional routes of politics, political science, working for institutions like the United Nations or embassies or all of that would sort of potentially help in transforming the world. But that sort of was met with some disillusionment rather early on. And so I was still sort of looking at how can we organize better. And I'll tell you why I think I'm qualified to speak, maybe in the broader sense, not necessarily business only, but organizations, is because I think all of us are potential experts in the dysfunction of organizations at all levels. That could be bureaucracies, that could be academic institutions, that could be schools, that could be churches, that could be government. And of course, we always are also probably witness of functioning organizations. So there is hope. It's not like, hey, there is one way, which is a dysfunctional way. There are multiple ways how you can organize better. And I think my way of looking at what I call humanistic management is how you manage, how you organize. And it's not pertaining only to business. It's pertaining to all organizations. And that's why I feel qualified to speak to that, because I have a little bit of experience in all of the organizational types, including business. And yeah, that's maybe the
Great.
short answer.
This is great. I was trying to pull your leg a bit, and actually, I knew you had these experiences to make it concrete. Let's get right onto it. You wrote a book. I said that I read the book. It's called Humanistic Management. The essence, because it's not a book review, it's let's get right into humanistic management. I think this is one of the core reasons why I wanted to invite you, because I do regard you as a thought leader on trying to be very explicit and put a paradigmatic frame going to the core why we look at organizations and the way how we do business in the wrong way, going to the very root on who we are as human beings. And you have a different opinion. So I'll let you elaborate a bit the core message around why management needs to be humanistic and what you mean by humanistic.
Okay, good. And so maybe some of you have heard this before, but the framing that we use is the protection of dignity and the promotion of flourishing or well-being. So this is actually very old. This is a very Aristotelian notion for those that have some background in philosophy. This is also very much in alignment with all the insights from evolutionary biology. And so in many ways, I went through a traditional education, as you mentioned, sort of in some way, not a bad education. But in that education, what you get is a very unreflected assumption set of who we are as human beings. And that is the foundation for organizing and for management and for business specifically, right? And that in a shorthand version is that we are in some way Homo Oeconomicus, or maybe some advanced notion of the resourceful, evaluative, maximizing man. And all we know is for us, for ourselves, to utility maximize. And that assumption carries through in many ways, paradigmatically, as Konstantin, as you said, through the way we organize society. We organize society around GDP, we organize businesses and organizations around some KPIs, typically profitability, market share, something of that sort. And even our own lives, we measure by some form of that notion of how much we have, the bank account, etc., the status, the power.
Quantitative, materialistic
measures, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. If you go into the history of it, we used to get from a very qualitative perspective on basically in some of the religious societies on how likely your soul will be saved, which was a squishy kind of assessment to, okay, how much you add value towards a society of honor in terms of being a knight or a soldier or somebody that contributes to the king, etc., to now we have alternative measures that maybe open up different ways of success. So I'm not criticizing overall the intellectual heritage of it and the way that we got there. I think what I criticize in many ways is that we stopped there. And the stopping is much about like not understanding who we are as human beings more accurately. And evolutionary biology tells us a lot about that. And it turns out that it matches with the ancient wisdom traditions, with some of the core insights of the humanities. And so in that sense, what we bring to the table through this conversation, I think, is a new perspective, a paradigmatically updated, accurate conversation, or better conversation about who we are as human beings. If you go through the book, you'll see the treatment of that. It's basically a version of how we can assess what it means to be human by having 4 drives: the drive to acquire, the drive to bond, the drive to comprehend, and the drive to defend. And you can measure those, and it matches very much with what sort of other scientific fields, especially in health and well-being, are saying is helpful to longevity, well-being, happiness, thriving. And so we just sort of make that available as a way to understand people in a broader context. And the typical ways that sort of counter the traditional dominant, which we call economistic perspective, is that we're fundamentally social. We're fundamentally social, and we fundamentally need meaning in our lives. And you all know Viktor Frankl's In Search for Meaning. that if you have a why, you can support or live through almost any how. But we seem to miss this in the bigger conversation about organizations. And I think the main reasons that people don't like to work for the organizations that they're in is because they don't have trusting relationships with people and they don't have a higher purpose. And then oftentimes they don't feel safe. So at least 3 of the core human evolutionary drives are violated consistently. So we're talking about consciousness, and I'm going to stay away from the conversation about capitalism because I think it's a dysfunctional discourse. But the consciousness, I think, is about, do we have a higher level understanding of who we truly are? And then can we organize in ways that actually allow ourselves and others to flourish?
Let me interject here a quick question. And I have actually a question to the audience. There's 2 things I'm going to double click. One is you emphasize a lot the element of dignity, which I think is key. We even put it in the headline announcing this dialogue, that a organization that isn't respecting dignity cannot, in the terminology of conscious capitalism, cannot be called conscious. So we will double click on that. Before we do that, my question to the audience, those that feel like it, add your definition. Please don't make it too long or too elaborate, but maybe a couple of words. What do you understand by dignity? What does it mean for you? And while you do that, inviting the audience to add that in the chat, my question is on these 4 drives. If you can add maybe a sentence to each of them. And one thing that I took away from your book, which I found fundamental, because it corresponds to sort of my personal worldviews, is these 4 drives need to be in balance. Whenever humans and then organizations tend to optimize, maximize 1 or 2 at the detriment of the others, things break and fall apart. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's correct. And I want to credit Paul Lawrence, who I had the privilege of working with in sort of Harvard Business School at the beginning of the century. He passed away in 2000.
Wow, you saying that feels like
yeah.
already.
It sounds like kind of crazy and old, and I feel like, yeah, death is knocking on the door. Well, anyway, Paul really was the one that sort of drove into this scientific literature, the evolutionary literature, and he shared some of the draft books with me, and I thought, this is exactly what I'm about in terms of like the new paradigm, right? So I just want to credit him because that kind of work is, to me, very foundational. And he, maybe as context, he was worried as one of the sort of key faculty at Harvard Business School when people said it was more of an intellectual school. Was worried about the overtake of agency theory, basically the takeover of the paradigmatic framework of agency theory, which builds on an updated version of Homo Oeconomicus, which is REMM by Michael Jensen and others. And so that gives rise to this financial perspective of the firm and the corporate governance mechanisms that we all basically lived through in the 80s and the 90s, and we still sort of live through those effects now, which basically says we're only interested in ourselves. And so if you want anybody in the organization do something that is in alignment with shareholders or something, then you need to align those interests. That's why you have these perverse kind of compensation packages and this general mistrust, which just begets more and more mistrust. Now, this is a maximization strategy, right? And in many ways, I think most of us, if not reflected, are subscribing to some kind of maximization strategy. So now, going to the 4 drives, you can Google that. You can Google, in the meantime, so many people are building their careers and their speaking engagement and consulting careers on let's maximize purpose, let's maximize trust, let's maximize psychological safety. So everybody is sort of talking about, yeah, those other drives that are missing, but oftentimes collapse it with we need to maximize it. So there's not much of a shift in the paradigm other than we're just going to maximize now something else. And if you go through history and just use the historical accounts, whenever you had collapses of societies, collapses of villages, of polities, etc., it's oftentimes attributable to a maximization strategy. The maximization of defense, the maximization of purpose, the maximization of the nationality, the bonding, etc. America first, Germany first, whatever you want to call first. If you want to put your tribe above somebody else's tribe, you violate dignity of that other tribe, and you're going to get in conflict automatically, right? And it typically is, even if it's like almost as close to extinction as you can see right now, and you've seen in history, it's because there is no balancing function, right? And our mathematical systems are not oriented towards balance. We maximize functions, we optimize functions. We have the tools for optimization and maximization when the biology of life and the intelligence of life points to balancing of various drives, right? In the context of what Paul Lawrence says, it's 4 drives. How do you balance them? The Eastern wisdom gives us sort of insights, right? And meditation and yoga and all these practices that sort of are very popular, ultimately sort of options to balance. And I think that's really where the consciousness piece comes in. The consciousness is an option for us to balance, because if we're not conscious, we can just be run by an algorithm. We can just put everything that we want into a function, which is happening right now with AI, and people are unconsciously sort of like maximizing something else, whatever it may be. But we're oftentimes very unconscious in terms of how we actually want to live. And I just close, if you know the studies on the blue zones, which has its criticisms, if you know the study on longevity, if you know the study on well-being, all of them come to the conclusion that it's an act of balancing.
Indeed.
So,
Indeed. I thought this is very appropriate, and thank you for double-clicking and explaining this a little bit further. Going into the topic of dignity, thank you, those that shared. It's the most inherent value of human beings. The notion that people are not means, but the objective, respecting and valuing each other, talking about love, full acceptance, deserving of respect and appreciation. This is not a test, this is not a contest. Give us the way you use the definition of dignity. I know you didn't do the research and invented it, certainly not. Donna Hicks did, and you may talk to that. Give us an idea why this, what it is in the specific way of humanistic management, and why it's so important.
yeah, maybe let me also give background. I mean, nobody invented this dignity piece. That is around and has been around for a long time. The framing of it can be sort of used in different multiple ways. And there are 3 distinct ways that you can see dignity. The earlier version of dignity is something that is earned. So it's a dignitarian approach. So when you look at when Seneca and others are writing, dignity is something, the dignity of the office, the dignity of the functionary, the dignity of a person that carries itself with a certain self-respect, but also with respect towards others. But it's actually something that people earn. And then through, I think, also a formulation of, or reformulation of some of the more fundamental Christian and Judeo-Christian tenets of we are all born as children of God in the image of God, etc. You can actually see a very early sort of like convergence in a way that actually you don't need to earn dignity, you have it, right? So it's an intrinsic value. And that you have walked throughout civilization in different ways. It's maybe more manifest right now after massive dignity violations in the codification of human rights as the foundation, right? So that sort of happened 200, 300 years ago as an early precursor. But it also happened in the Catholic faith tradition, for example, specifically when invasions of Latin America happened, and that question came about, how do you treat indigenous people? Are people that are not fundamentally Catholic, and do they have dignity? And so there are a number of really powerful philosophers who basically said, well, yes, according to our own faith, everybody is a child of God, and that's where the dignity concept then comes from. That's a very religious sort of grounding. Kant then took that and sort of secularized it in a way where it's like, okay, dignity is something that is categorizing that which doesn't have a price. all the things in
Right.
life that have inherent value. So I oftentimes joke, if you remember the MasterCard advertising that says, the best things in life are free, blah, 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 blah. For everything else, it's sort of something that you can use the card for. This is one of the most powerful, whatever, longest running ad campaigns, because it speaks to this notion of, we all understand that the best things in life that we care about are free. They transcend the pricing mechanism. They transcend the market mechanism,
Interesting.
right? Unfortunately, in much of what we're talking about, we elevate still in the old paradigm the market as the source of wisdom, the market as the source of decision making. And that sort of totally, in that context, violates dignity, because, of course, dignity is not a commercial good. It's not something that you can trade.
It's not tradable. Yeah.
It's not tradable. So it escapes that logic. So I think that's what we witness in our conversation globally, is we sort of reduce unconsciously and then in many ways, stay there, everything that's valuable to that which is prized, right? And so that's why we have the problems that we have. We violate the integrity of the dignity of the environment. We violate the integrity and the dignity of people. And that's where we have all the crises sourced in. So that notion of dignity as either earned or the one that is more powerful, I think, the intrinsic one, are key. Now, typically people use dignity for human dignity. I think what's critical, powerful in a conceptual way is that dignity is, as Kant says, transcending anything that is not commodifiable, right? So that if you look at anything that's of value to people, including a healthy environment, including, I don't know, sometimes institutions that people really value and cherish, it's like, okay, the market price is not a good function. It's not a good approach to deal with it. It doesn't invalidate the market. It just says that there are many things in our lives that the market is not appropriate for, right? And community, or even, let's say, authority, are other ways that we have been organizing in a way that maybe need to be revisited and complement some of the things that we can manage through the market.
Let me ask a question then. So the market, being a trained economist myself, actually serves only one purpose. I'm radically simplifying, of course, which is to optimize resource allocation. That's a basic question why economists actually, that's a leading question they have. How do you optimize resource allocation? It all boils down to that question. Now, as you rightly say, if you have facts in life, we're now using the word dignity, that are not optimizable per definition, they don't have a price tag to them, they're not commodifiable, etc. What possible alternatives arise then? And let's be specific in terms of behaviors, Handlungsanweisungen, as you would say in German, things that you suggest. What flows from that in a practical sense? What practices would be more appropriate?
So, I mean, in the simplest way, let's go to a basic team and an organization, right? You can say, all right, we want to maximize in this team market share for, I don't know, XYZ product, paper machines, something like that. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go for clients and let's sort of figure out who can sell the most, et cetera, et cetera. And you can do this just by assigning an algorithm to who is calling these people, and you never have a conversation about this in your team. You're basically just individuals selling stuff. Right? I think that's sort of a reality that many people can empathize with. That's how many organizations sort of organize. What we see is that these kind of organizations can function, of course, but the teams that actually are called teams, where they support each other, where they can actually learn from each other more quickly, are the ones that also, not just, but also have a mechanism in it which allows them to bond. And that can be established by just listening, by being together, by spending time together, but also by understanding the higher purpose that they serve, and by feeling safe in the space in which they operate. In most sales teams, it's like, well, if you don't meet the sales goals, you're cut. Well, in some other function, it could be the dignity piece is actually very clearly linked to you not just, you actually being able to learn and not just perform, right? And that the learning happens through mistakes, maybe through ways that you are not performing. And in that way that you can grow more deeply as a person. So in many ways, the data speaks for itself that most organizations that are very successful in the long term, midterm, etc., are humanistically organized. They recognize this fundamental humanity and that dignity, and they do so and are successful on the market. So it's not like an either or, it's like a both and. If you have an understanding of the market and what you can commodify, that's very good. It's like one conversation. And there is another conversation that is that which is dignity, right? And that you want to manage for. That's actually what you can manage. That's where good management or conscious management, conscious leadership is making a difference. Other than that, it will just be technocratic, whatever algorithmic management, and you don't actually need the function of a manager.
It's very interesting. That reminds me, actually, I recommend that book, other than Michael's book, Humanistic Management, from Ed Freeman. He calls it, who's maybe not, hasn't maybe not invented, but revitalized and modernized the notion of stakeholder integration. And he has a recent book, about 6 years, The Power of And, where he suggests that it's not a contradiction, it's either or. And I like how you put it. You need to have both conversations, a market commodifiable optimization type of conversation, and a conversation that puts an aspect like dignity in the center. Let me probe to get a little bit more practical even. And let me repeat, we have half an hour off, that you're very much invited to either ask a question, put it in the chat, or raise the virtual hand. I guess you all know how to do that in Zoom by now. And ask a question or add a comment. Okay? And I can read it off. Don't feel that you have to speak up and you may be shy. I can read it off the chat if you prefer. There we go. We have the first question. Let me continue, and then I'll quickly go to Basilio. Thank you for lifting your arm. What would be, in as practical terms as you can speak to it, Michael, a humanistic leader in your mind? What are some of the key features? I know it's always difficult to simplify as if it's certain behaviors, but do your best to proxy what in your mind a humanistic leader is.
I mean, it's very simple. A humanistic leader is one that protects dignity and promotes flourishing.
Okay.
Right. And is on a pathway to learning how to do that better, right? It's not like, hey, this is a perfect one size fits all that you do all the time. No, but this is your ambition. It's not that different from conscious leader or whatever qualification you want to have for anything, right? A good leader, a transformational leader, whatever. It just sort of shines the light on these other sort of aspects, because we think that you can be a conscious leader and lead for money making. You can be a conscious leader and or a transformational leader and go for power. We see this. We have transformational leaders. Right? The question is, what are they transforming for?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, Jeff Bezos, I guess, in all right, is a transformational leader, having co-invented and optimized what we call e-commerce AV business. Well, Basilio, since you have the courage, lift your arm and speak up, open your microphone and go ahead with a question or comment.
Yeah, I was wondering about dignity, right? And how extending dignity too broadly could, at the end, lead to the devaluation of human dignity itself, right? We see it now with people more conscious or more preoccupied with their dogs, their pets, other situations, right? And we tend not to be empathic to humans, right? Couldn't that be a problem, extended that definition too broadly?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the definition is extended broadly, or there is a way to see the definition extended broadly, right? I don't think necessarily it is very functional in a way, if we want to talk about leadership in business. But what if, like, why would it not be possible to honor the dignity of your dog and the dignity of your coworkers? I don't see that those are exclusive. I think this is where the consciousness mindset comes in. If you're able to do that protection of dignity for one, you actually have access to doing it for everybody. Do you do it? No, not necessarily, right? But can you create conditions for that? I think so, because you already have the ability to do that for, let's say, dogs. And I work with a number of people that sort of use dogs as an inroad for people to think about, well, what would it be like if we were all treating up to the expectations of our dog, or the way that our dog sees us, right? And so anyway, there's like different ways to go about it. I don't necessarily think that this is a reductionist concept, right? It's not like a resource that is finite. I think you can grow it, much like information, love, and others. The more you share it, the more you practice it, the more it grows. So it contradicts the economistic logic.
Thanks. Before I head over to Iris, I saw your hand. Quickly, because I think it falls in the same element. In your book, or somewhere else, they speak about false dignity. So I fully recognize, because I did some reading to prepare for this, the noble truth that sits in with dignity. I equal that caught under the term of false dignity. There could be a lot of pretext. Oh, I need this. I need you to pay me respect.
Right.
And unless you do that, I don't feel that I'm getting the dignity that I deserve. So I think that is, how much do you, in reality, let's not make this an academic answer, how much do you think, well, it actually isn't easy to steer through genuine dignity and to the trade-offs? Okay, and I heard your answer. It doesn't mean you don't try it, but give us maybe some idea on the difficulties to practice that in reality and to stay true to it.
The first difficulty is to just bring up a conversation about dignity in that space, because it's like, oh, it's dismissed as either trivial or unrelated and soft, right? Much like the conversation about consciousness as well. The second one is when you use that concept of dignity, yes, people typically misunderstand, quote unquote, this as respect. And it's like, hey, I demand respect, I demand dignity. And if I don't get it, if I'm not treated with specific whatever ways, then I'm not going to engage. So we had, for example, meetings where people said, I just want to speak longer and my dignity is violated if I don't get more time than anybody else, or if I can't speak my truth. Like, well, that's not dignity. That's just a special treatment that you want. And so it can create new conflicts, right? Different forms of conflicts if you go down that route. And if you're not grounded in a shared understanding of dignity, it's actually something that we all have, that we all share, right? And it's actually as Donna Hicks says, the highest common denominator. It's not a reason for, I want to be special. Like, there is a lot of conversation that may be guided towards dignity, but that is also ultimately about my particular self-interest. And I want to be treated special because somehow I'm different.
Okay. Thank you. Iris, please.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a very inspiring conversation. I was very, surprised, but what you were saying about the optimization, like suddenly I realized, we also this is how we live. We want to optimize the time. If we all the time need to optimize something. It's never. And then I thought to myself, but in a way, the conscious business paradigm is that we still optimize, but we optimize the value for the whole, for the all stakeholders. And then I was thinking to myself, so is it okay if we optimize something for the benefit of everyone, or still we need to think in it's like a mind shift, let's begin to balance things instead of all the time optimizing something.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'm not sure that I've thought it all through to unpack it at such detail where it's like, okay, what would that mean in distinction, like to balance? One of the things that I can see that people react to is when you optimize, you actually have a promise for the future that you have something more or something better, right? When you balance, for some people, that means you just sort of distribute what you have. Now, I don't want people to mistake the balancing conversation about like, hey, we cannot progress, right? But I think the idea that, yes, even if you want to call it optimization, which is a sort of a non-mathematical form of optimization, like you optimize everything. So that's not a real qualifier of anything, right? If you optimize everything, then you at least must balance something, right? So the question is, in your equation, what are the parameters that you want to consider? And if you do that for everybody, for many stakeholders of an organization, if you do that for the world, then I think it gets very difficult to manage. So my shorthand is like, if you can manage for yourself in a heuristic way, like you manage your own dignity, then you have an access point to manage the dignity of others. And then you have an access point of managing the dignity of many, right?
Yes, it's a very nice observation that balancing takes us to the moment, to the present, and optimization is always like detach us from the moment and what will be, what will happen, what will have more. So it's really against being in the moment. Thank you.
Well observed. Thanks. I'm going to take the freedom to summarize two questions which are on the chat because I think they are very related. One is from Giselle, the other one is from Lilia, and they both relate to, in very practical terms, impediments, hindrances. What do you think holds CEOs, entrepreneurs back? What makes it so difficult? Or you could flip it around. What do you think would be elements that should be in place? Let's be a little bit political about this, to actually foster a move towards more humanistic management.
So it's an interesting conversation. So I will say this may sound heretical, but I want you to test it. Most successful entrepreneurs will have to operate humanistically. Whether they are aware of it or not, they don't know, right? But anything that actually works has to be an act of balancing the interest of several people. Just think about a small mom and pop company, or think about a small startup, even in Silicon Valley. If people don't have a higher purpose to getting together, if all they want to do is get money, it's a very fragile way of organizing. Even banks, before the financial crisis, when they check for credit for an entrepreneur, they look at what problem are they trying to solve? What purpose do they have? Do they have good teams? That's what they're looking for. They don't look for, oh, does this guy want to make a lot of money? Does he want to be very powerful? In fact, that's a risk. And they wouldn't loan any money to a person at that. Why? Because that kind of person is probably going to be a very risky investment, if not a bank robber, right? So just to make it explicit, it's like, it's a foundational way that we tend to operate, especially look at crisis situation. And I'm not necessarily comparing a startup to a crisis situation, but it is a situation where you don't have resources, right? And so you need to do something else. And that's typically how humans have always operated. Just think about a crisis situation. What happens? Even in COVID, people start reaching out because we're not fundamentally individuals. We fundamentally are social. So we start looking for others. The fact of starting an enterprise is a fundamental social endeavor because you want to do something with others for others. Even though you can sort of reduce the motivation there to say, I just want to be rich. But most of those organizations that just want to be rich, they typically don't succeed. And so if you go back to some of the most maligned organizations now, Facebook, Google, the Silicon Valley organizations, if you trace them back, they were founded in a very humanistic spirit. They still They only actually worked because they provided some social value. Very clear for Facebook. People went there because they wanted to bond with friends, not because they wanted to watch ads. Google was actually known for saying, we don't want to be evil. We want to get the information for everybody to you, etc. A fundamental value creation that had a higher purpose. And only in retrospect, when they were so successful that they had to be on the stock market, that they were publicly listed, they had to comply with what we call economistic paradigmatic logic. And then you would see that their founders would be kicked out, that a CEO from a financial firm most of the time would come in, and then they would start being quote unquote serious business people, cutting cost, raising revenue, violating trust, doing evil things, being the kind of maligned type of organizations that they are now, because they're fundamentally violating the conscious sort of social contract, right?
Or the humanistic core upon which they were founded.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just putting this out there as an example that we oftentimes miss to see what works and why it works, because our paradigmatic lens wants us to make us believe that we're all these Homo Oeconomicus people, just greedy. And the textbook in economics says, yes, an entrepreneur wants to make money and that's why he is successful. And much of that is just not empirically validated.
Let me build on that and add the question. I just looked at chat from Nadia. Nadia refers to, well, I guess most people are dealing with their own emptiness as they search for others to treat them, etc., etc. So there's an element of, and I'm going to just paraphrase then, inner journey that is very crucial. And let me put into context what we asked before, using the question from Giselle. What external circumstances would help with that? And you mentioned the stories of Silicon Valley companies where external circumstances being pressure from the stock market, investors, from the market, and sometimes it's customers that demand, and you give in to the customer demand, versus fortifying, developing, growing, expanding the inner virtues. Let's speak to that latter one. How important do you think to go through that journey and expand humanistic management more, given the market forces, the financial pressures are so big, sometimes unsurmountable big? How much do you think having an intact inner journey is critical and vital for any humanistic manager in the future?
Well, I think it's critical for anybody, anytime, right? And of course, it's even more critical for somebody who is taking on responsibility, no matter what time. You'll always have pressures from the outside, whether they are from the market or they're from the government or they're from criminal gangs or they're from whatever it may be. You will have outside forces that you can use as an excuse, right? And oftentimes that's the easy way to think about it. And that's what we're almost, unfortunately, lapsing into thinking about at this point of time, that there are such forces and there's conspiracy theories going around that are very highly in demand because they give us an explanation for why the world is the way it is. When in fact, yes, if you have a stronger inner center, a stronger faith, or a stronger consciousness, or a stronger inner journey, there's always something where you can see you can actually do something and maybe more. And maybe you can do something more with people that are on that journey. And I think that's what conscious capitalism is ultimately about. This is what many of the people are doing here. And of course, that's a critical, quote unquote, resource that we're trying to tap into more so in university context, but it hasn't been traditionally part of a university education, right? So I think that inner education, that was the domain of many of the spiritual traditions. I think you can see that that has worked to some degree, but in many cases, that's sort of seen as separate, like Sunday school is happening 1 hour on Sunday. The rest of the world is happening then, and never the twain shall meet. And so now you see almost like a force from outside is bringing people to connect this, because we cannot be these schizophrenic people that are just having a spiritual way of looking at the world and then a worldly way. You're forced to align those things. And I think that's where consciousness conversations come in. That's where our humanistic conversation comes in, because it actually does provide a bridge for the universal spiritual conversations and the universal worldly conversations as well. Like we want to do certain things in the world that actually can be improved if we are spiritually grounded and connected to a higher self, right? Or a higher version of ourselves, however we want to call it. And I think that's the test of time. That's like we are being tested right now. And every time, right, humanity was tested in different ways.
You mentioned education. Well, education is key, and you said there has been a strong sense of separation from lecturers in the university to Sunday school. You're an educator, you're a professor at Fordham University, and I know that you care, this is how we got to know each other, a lot about changing the way how business is educated to be more humanistic, based on the humanistic paradigm, for example, and everything that you explained. Give us maybe a quick sense of, because you're very much in depth into this topic, what are the 2 or 3, 4 things you think really need to change? Nobody's pretending they're easy to change the way business is educated for better.
Yeah, thank you. I think the question and the conversation about inner development is a critical one. I think it's not that hard. I think that many people can open spaces for those conversations in their classroom about any subject, right? You can use any subject, whether it's operations, whether it's marketing, whether it's supply chain management, saying, like, what do you think? Like, how would you feel if you were that person? And that's it. Humanize it, get it back into a human perspective, and that get people to think about what is their inner response to that and bring the human back into that conversation. Then at a higher level, of course, the conversation about new paradigm, like how do you educate? Are we even aware? Are we conscious in education? No, we're not. I'm not saying that's only business education. I think that's most of education. And so there needs to be a shift on all levels in terms of like, what are we expecting from education? Mm-hmm. And is it maybe going back to formation? What kind of formation is happening? What do we want? How do we want people to be? Who do we want our kids to become once they go through education, right? My son is going to be a senior, my oldest, in high school. He's become a good test taker and wants to do engineering. Does he like it? No, it's just like something that he's good at. But I would have expected or hoped for a different way of education where people are connected more to their inner passion, their inner desires, their inner deeper sort of contribution, and just have space for that. I think we can do that. I don't think we are enough, but I think the pressures that we're experiencing now will force us to revisit education at all levels, business education more specifically. And yes, that kind of notion of what does it mean to be human and how do we flourish and how do we organize for flourishing, I think is core to that transformation.
Are there any best practices? And let me be actually broad, not down to details. What are companies that students, not only people here to hear on the phone, on the Zoom call, which are kind of...
Ay, bien a gusto el clima, ¿no? Allá.
I think I need to find who's talking. Please mute your microphones, everybody. Thank you. What are good companies if you think, oh, we really need to set examples, better examples, exemplars, leaders or companies, and that is one way, I'm not saying the only way, to bring in front of students so they can actually learn from those. What examples do you use? What examples come to your mind, be it companies or leaders that you actually think are examples of humanistic management?
Yeah, so let me qualify this. I think it's always difficult to sort of elevate one because it becomes almost like this is going to be a saint. They're all human and they're all good in one aspect and maybe not so good in another one. But it's a signal or an example of a possibility, a human possibility that most people don't know about. So for example, we are now in the process of making documentary films on companies that we think are particularly interesting in a way that they're such outliers. So Grayston Bakery in Yonkers, New York is doing open hiring and allowing people to get jobs that typically wouldn't be allowed to get jobs, oftentimes formerly incarcerated, right? But that's a way for them to get people back into society, contributing positively, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ben & Jerry's is supporting that in different ways, so that's another company. Then I think you have the long-stayed sort of companies that were sort of early in the consciousness journey of, that are now sometimes struggling because they're not so clear in their purpose, like The Body Shop and others. Natura in Brazil, you could mention, is a large beauty company that's also considered a social movement or a women's empowerment movement. You have Mondragon in Spain that many of you probably are familiar with as a sort of cooperative organization that is, I think, 90 companies, 90 cooperatives right now organized, 90,000 or 70,000 employees, financially successful, I think either number 10 or number 11 in the traditional ranking of businesses in Spain. Sekem in Egypt is an initiative that has 5 or 6 companies and transforms the desert into oasis, basically, in a way that they capture through biodynamic agriculture carbon out of the air, put it in the soil, get the soil to be regenerative, and create communities around that then also create businesses. And they're the market leader, for example, in herbal teas in the MENA region. And so there are all kinds of examples. Triodos Bank, some of you know, there is the Narayana Healthcare Center in India. That's sort of an example. And what we're trying to do, we've written and edited many books and case studies, etc., just to showcase that this is a reality that proves possibility. And it's a universal option. You can find it in any culture. You can find those examples in any country if you look. And you can find those like independent of what their faith tradition is, what their culture is. And so, yeah, that's sort of what we try to teach and get people to be, aware of. And I think in the conscious capitalism movement, you have many of such organizations. I recently had the pleasure with Luis Gerardo to see a number of Mexican companies that are practicing that in their context. And so, yeah, I think it's a human option, a human possibility, and a reality.
Thanks for that. It was good to hear so many companies. I myself was actually sometimes surprised how, in relative terms, these companies then appear. I'm speaking of Europe, okay? Because the examples were mainly US or Latin American, how little these companies appear in classes in business schools in Europe. So I think there's also room to create examples, because it's one important way how people learn. They either learn by the academic standards, they read books and they hear lessons, or they follow an example. Okay?
Yeah. And let me just explain maybe why some of this is sort of very tilted, because the amount of companies that are publicly listed that are basically the backbone of business education, because the information is publicly accessible, it's less than 1 per mil, right? The most number of organizations, and we can go through the numbers again, because I think it's even fewer organizations that dominate the mind share of what we talk about in terms of business. Most businesses are family businesses.
Yeah.
They're family-owned businesses, or they're mom and pop shops, small and medium-sized companies, but you don't have case studies on them. That information is not public. And even though that's the backbone, especially in countries like Germany and Spain, for sure, in Italy, in northern Italy, etc. So we miss the bigger picture. And I'd say that most of these organizations are actually humanistically organizing, whether they think about it that way or not. But the tragedy is that they think they need to become like the publicly listed organizations. And so they typically have, in a third generation, their son go to a prestigious MBA school, and then they come back and say, all right, now we need to do real business. And they basically buy in an economistic mindset that ultimately will destroy most of the foundations that the more humanistically oriented or consciously oriented forefathers have, or foremothers have built. So I think that's a real tragedy. I also want to point to the odds are in a conscious favor, the odds are in a humanistic favor, if we were to just look.
Speaking about odds, last question. We have 2 minutes to go. We're going to finish on time. I'm going to actually take one of the questions from Giselle of the chat again. What's a story or moment that gives you hope that humanistic management can scale and influence mainstream business practice? What are the odds? What is your outlook? What gives you hope?
Hope gives me that people are fundamentally miserable in the current state. So we're not designed to be miserable and defeatist the way that we are. I think the latest statistics say 70% of people are disengaged at work, they hate their job, and they think that we're producing results that nobody wants. And they're contributing to it. So I think my hope is that some kind of awareness shock is going to come in so that people will rethink what they're doing and understand that they have options. So that's hope. The other thing has less to do with hope. It's more conviction. I know it works better for my life. So whether there is hope or not is actually very secondary. It's okay. You need to figure out what do you think is worth it, what works, and then continue. Whether there's hope or not, whether there's external validation or not, doesn't matter.
Thank you for your outlook. We're up on time. I'd like to thank Michael specifically. I'd like to thank everybody that basically listened, came in, and actually participated. We will go into a summer break. I'm living in Spain, so people in July and August, they basically take off and take a summer vacation. We'll be back on the 9th of September with a very, very excellent and deep thought leader, David Sloan Wilson. And Michael referred to him once when he referred to Darwinism and the ideas of evolution. And there's some very, very interesting ideas that influence not only Michael, but Raj Sisodia himself in terms of how groups prosper and what we can learn from evolution into the success of groups in a sense of conscious business. With that, thanks everybody. Have a good afternoon and see you again after the summer break on September 9th. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you.